Now, what he says here is, inasmuch as I'm apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. So what's that talking about? Well, that's Paul saying what I just said in his own words. Although Paul's mission is primarily to the Gentiles, it's not exclusively to the Gentiles. Paul has not cast his fellow Jews aside in his mission of bringing the gospel, right? And you can see this with another quote from 1 Corinthians, another letter of Paul. So it's not in Romans, but this is the background. Listen to these words from 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 to 22 about Paul's universal mission. He says this, quote, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being without law toward God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some." That's Paul's missionary strategy. He wants to save everyone. He wants the gospel to come to everyone. So in Romans 11, what he's saying is, I'm magnifying my ministry among the Gentiles, not because I've rejected my Jewish brothers and sisters, but because I want them to see the conversions that are happening among the Gentiles, to make them jealous, so to speak. He's speaking a little hyperbolically there, so that I might save some of them. So you see, Paul's mission to the Gentiles is not a rejection of his fellow Jews and of his fellow Israelites. That's the first point I want to make here. Because again, there's a pernicious error that runs around out there, and has run around at least since the 2nd century AD, at the time of Marcion, who was one of the first great arch heretics in the early church. And what Marcion did was he pitted the Old Testament against the New Testament. And he pitted the God of Israel against the God of the Christians. And he basically described the Old Testament God as a God of wrath and judgment, and as a different God than the New Testament God. And one version of that Marcionite heresy of two different gods has been, and I've encountered this before in certain students who will assume, well, in the Old Testament, God chooses the Jewish people, the Israelites, and rejects the pagans. And then in the New Testament, he changes his mind and he chooses the Gentiles and rejects the Jewish people, right? So it's kind of schizophrenic God who's capricious in his election or rejection of different groups of people. Well, and this is a common, actually, it's not just my students. Contemporary atheists will often have that kind of a view of the Bible. Think of the God of the Bible as this capricious God who's just picking certain favorites among the human race and then rejecting other groups of people. That is totally, totally wrong and totally a caricature. More than just a character, it's an egregious misinterpretation of the Bible itself. Already in the Old Testament, you can see that God has his sights set on all the peoples of the world being saved through Israel, right? And the same thing's true in the New Testament. Paul himself in Romans is emphasizing that God has not rejected his people, right? The chosen people are not rejected because the gospel is now going to all, both Jew and Gentile. It's not a reversal of the election of Israel in the Old Testament. But some people think that's what Paul's saying because of the next verse. So if you look at the next verse, what does Paul say? He says, "For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead?" Okay, notice the expression, their rejection. You could read it in two ways. You could read it as them, meaning Israel, being rejected by God, like they're the object of his rejection. Or you could read it as them rejecting the gospel or the good news about Christ. In other words, they're the subjects of the rejection. And many people who take that caricature that I brought up earlier would read it the first way. They would argue, look, see, Paul says that the Jewish people are rejected by God. But we know that's not what Paul means, because Paul himself, at the beginning of the chapter, Romans 11, says this, "I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means." Okay? So a little rule for you. If you want to know what Romans 11 verse 15 means, it's helpful to go back to the beginning of the chapter and read it in context, right? So if at the beginning of the chapter, Paul says God has not rejected his people, and then he makes an ambiguous statement about their rejection, and you got two ways you can read it. You have to take the second one, meaning them rejecting Jesus' messiahship, not God rejecting them as a people, because he's already made clear that that's not the case. In fact, he's emphatically insisted on that not being the case at the beginning of Romans 11. So what he's talking about here is, what he is saying is, if the rejection of Jesus' messiahship by the majority of the Israelite people meant the reconciliation of the world. In other words, if that becomes the catalyst, the springboard for the gospel going out to the pagans, then what will their acceptance of Jesus' messiahship mean but life from the dead? In other words, Paul here is laying the foundation for the common eschatological expectation in the church, in the history of the church, that before Christ's second coming, before the final resurrection of the dead, there would be a kind of mass conversion or acceptance of Jesus' messiahship by a large number of the Jewish people. That's where that tradition, if you ever wondered where that comes from, in part from this verse right here, Romans 11, verse 15. So in Paul's mind, in other words, what Paul's saying is, I'm the apostle of the Gentiles. I'm trying to get as many Gentiles to become Christians as possible so that my fellow Jews will see it and recognize and accept Jesus as the Messiah. And in doing so, that mass acceptance of Jesus as Messiah will usher in, or so to speak, inaugurate the final coming of Jesus, the final resurrection of the dead.